Well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining me today. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about hanging stone asset. So this is a steam-assisted gravity drainage asset. Um, Really, the audience that's suitable for this will be probably like students and maybe investors that starting investing in the oil and gas sector with focus on Canadian thermal oil production. And for students, when it comes to students, I'm gonna get this, maybe 4 or 5 students in January, and this video will help them to kind of get better education on baseline for some of the thermal assets, which we will be optimizing together during their course. And my name is Alex Philstein. I specialize in thermal oil production. Um, I specialize in optimization for thermal oil operations and the green technology integration. So today we're going to talk about Athabasca Oil Sands, their asset that's called Hanging Stone. One thing I can provide an update, I developed software that basically calculates the different parameters for the asset. We're going to be talking a lot about this asset today. And what I can tell you is that this asset currently produces about 7,214 barrels per day. And in the previous month, before they reported, so today we're talking basically July data. And in about 2 weeks, I'll be reporting August data for this asset. So the previous month production was 7,252 barrels per day. And this is basically a change of a decline of 0.5% for the asset. The overall number for producing wells is 25. What you will see 5 pads, and each pad has 5 injectors and 5 producers. So very kind of clean operation when it comes to that. So no infills or anything like this, which could be an amazing opportunity going forward. And the average well producing about 288 barrels per day. And the best well that produces about 562 barrels per day at this hanging stone asset. Um, so the number of wells that operate above the average of 288 barrels per day is about 11, and the number below the average is 14. And the top 11 wells, they produce 61% of the overall production for the Hanging Stone SAGD asset. And the top 5 will produce about 32% of the overall production rate. Soon you will see the operations of how this works more specifically. We're going to be looking at the core. We're going to be looking at historic production. But one thing I can tell you is that the average injection steam, which is kind of a big achievement for Athabasca and Hanging Stone asset specifically, is about 24,063 barrels per day from the identified 25 injectors that I talked about. And the steam to oil ratio right now is about 3.33. They don't really have any infill integration that could be calculated, and I will talk a little bit more about that, explaining what that means. But the water produced to steam ratio is about 1.047, which is really good because ideally you would want that ratio to be 1, because the steam is being injected to the reservoir and it condenses and drains as water with the produced oil that it transfers its heat to kind of make the oil less viscous. And so they have a very good water ratio there, water to steam ratio. And since the previously reported data, production increased in 76% of the oil producing wells, which is pretty good. But the overall production on the asset slightly declined by 0.5%. And yeah, so this is something I'm closely monitoring on a monthly basis, and will provide a little bit more of a in-depth update going forward. But I think it's time to kind of go over the asset and talk more specifically about the opportunities and get more familiar with what the asset is doing. So what you see in the picture is essentially at the bottom here, you will see well pads for Athabasca oil sands. hanging stone asset. So this will be a well pad, and this is a well pad, and this is a well pad. So they have about 5 of those, right? So each pad has 5 injectors, producers. So and the way they work, they kind of work in a SAGD configuration. So you can see 5 of them here, 5 there, and 5 there, and outside of the picture, there's another 2. This is their central process facility where the steam is being generated and the production is coming back to facilities to be treated. So one line is going to the pad, getting the steam, the pad to inject the steam, and the other line is kind of bringing back the emulsion to be separated, and steam is being reinjected. And those are the steam generators. So today I will talk about the development overview for the asset and what they're going to be doing, subsurface overview, surface operations, and regulatory compliance, just like a quick note on that. So you can see here that the Hanging Stone project first team was in March 2015, and they started with 25 whelpers, and that's what they have today. When people talk about low sustaining capital or low cost of supply, we're talking about this type of assets, right? Because no new whelpers been integrated since 2015, so it's been 9 years, and we will see kind of the decline for those wells. And the company has plans to basically introduce new sustaining well pairs, which are basically being released in August. And when it comes to the rig that's getting released, but 2 well pairs will be integrated to sustain the production on the asset. They're going to utilize longer wells, so 1,400 meters lateral, so 1.4 kilometers, and they have a fairly competitive capital efficiency of 15,000 barrels dollars per barrel per flowing. Where if you see, let's say, at Strathcona acquiring Serafina as an example, the cost there was closer to 60,000 per flowing. So if the development is 15,000, it's very competitive. And so they basically decided to take the route of introducing 2 sustaining well pairs, and soon we will see maybe where it's going to be. So it's located about 20 kilometers from Fort McMurray, and like I said, it has 5 production pads and 5 pairs per pad, so very easy to understand. And this is kind of the Hanging Stone area where they operate, and the development area is here in pink, and the project area is kind of the bigger picture. And so they have also some infrastructure here where they have CPF, they have the fuel gas from TransCanada pipeline. So fuel gas is being used to generate the steam. Dilbit export to Enbridge Cheecham terminal, and diluent from Inter Pipeline IPL, which also can be seen on the map. This is kind of the bitumen that they produce, so it sits in situ. It's kind of very viscous in the rock, so in a sand that's under very high pressure, about 2000 kPa. And once the steam is injected, when you have injector and producer, you grow the steam chamber essentially over time, which is kind of what they're doing. And that oil that you see here is being drained by gravity essentially. So that's their core business. So those are the pads. So here you can see the 5 pads here: AA, AB, AD, AC, and AE. And here they discuss basically the opportunity for approved pad drainage areas in the future, right? Where here they have their CPF and the 5 pads that we talked about. The development area is 7.3 kilometers squared, and the project area is 7.8. So that just kind of illustrates the size of the lease of the asset. They do have some sections of the bottom water on their asset, and you can see, like for example, pad AB here has, and here's a bottom water kind of legend in meters. So the bottom water is located essentially here, and you can see the MD. So the the MD essentially stands for measured depth, right? And The other parameter here that you can see is SSTVD, which is essentially SSTVD stands for true vertical depth subsea. So subsea true vertical depth, or MD, which is the measured depth, right? So each company kind of uses things a little bit differently. And what you can see here is CPPO, and CPPO stands for oil saturation from core, or from reservoir perspective, this will be like an SO. So oil saturation, SO. But this is kind of like this is more for labs, for oil saturation from core. So what they do, they essentially extract the core and they look at the vertical section, and they're trying to understand basically what's inside the core. And when the core couple of reservoirs, they able to basically tell us where the bottom water was detected or other formations. So you can see they do have bottom waters here, and you can see the relative thickness. So it's not as severe in those sections, but when they essentially operate the SAGD process, steam assisted gravity drainage, what this essentially means is that the bottom hole pressure, so BHP, bottom hole pressure, must be sustained in those beds. Otherwise, the water just coming to the producing well. So that's kind of what it tells us. And the company, normally they monitor the water cut, so what's being produced, and able to kind of adjust and control their operations that way. Another way they could do is, for example, if you have a casing, like a producer that's very close to bottom water, and you can see clearly here sections that don't have bottom water, they can basically like kind of seal that section in a sense. It depends on the completions, of course, and kind of produce from those sections if it's visible. But in my understanding, this asset been seeing very low capex because most of the focus is on Lismer, rightfully so. So here they're just trying to maintain those operations. The other thing we could see is the Middle McMurray gas thickness map. So you, in addition to the bottom water formation, you also have some sections, and many assets in Alberta have this type of situation, have McMurray top gas. So when you essentially have the bitumen here in this section, and you can see the SO and the relative kind of oil saturation sections. So this will be a 1, so 100% oil saturation. This will be a 0. This will be about 80% oil saturation. So you can see some sections where oil saturation is not as high. But then you can also have top gas section, and we can see that pad AD, for example, has a small section of gas saturation, and that section between pad AD and AE also has a thickness of about 1 to 2 meters of gas saturation, which is not that big of a deal. But what that means is that when they develop their steam chambers, so if we have injector and producer, and they reach the overburden here, they could have some gas that's being met by the steam that was injected. So that gas could come to the producing well. So therefore, they need to maintain a little bit of a higher subcool to make sure that gas production is mitigated. The other thing we could look at is bitumen pay classification. So just like what we saw here in oil saturation for the core, you also have this parameter here, CPPO, which is, as I mentioned before, this is more from a lab perspective, oil saturation from core that was extracted. And you can see the different, basically, oil saturations here on that scale, which could be very, very well here, very well observed oil saturation in those sections, but not as much in other sections of the core. And by looking at MD, so as mentioned before, MD stands for measured depth. We can see basically that this is 152 meters, this is 192, so we have about 40 meter pay thickness for that core when it comes to bitumen. And you can see basically that there is variation in the gross bitumen in place, GBIP, across the various pads. And in some sections, for example, here in the central section, that pay could be as high as maybe 10-15 meters, which is a thin pay development. But in sections like this one, for example, or here, the darker sections, it could be also, the pay could be 40 meters, and you can have very nice bitumen formation. But the question then is, what happens in the sections that basically have lower oil saturation, or lower as defined here in this example, oil saturation from core? So what happens in those sections? So what you see here is that you could have basically different facies, and those are having different classification based on percentage of mud or kind of non-permeable regions in the reservoir. For example, F1 is breccia, right? And it's kind of variable. It varies all over the place. F2 is sand, where it comes to 0 to 10%. F3 is sandy IHS. IHS stands for inclined heterolithic stratification, which is essentially in the reservoir, you can have injector producer, and those sections that kind of look like this, those are kind of geological formations, but they're not normally permeable. So they could have some sandy inclined heterolithic stratifications. But then you can also have muddy IHS, which is even worse at 30 to 70%, that doesn't drain as much bitumen, and you can have absolute mud. And so what they say in here is essentially that gross bitumen in place reservoir criteria is then it's F1 to 4 and less than 1 meter of F5. So F5 stands for mud. So essentially mud is not part of the pay. So what's interesting in this situation, though, is that what we're learning, kind of just looking at this core right here, is that they could have a situation here where, based on this pay here, right, so where you have lower oil saturation sections, and maybe you have IHS or muddy IHS, you can have a situation where if you have injector and producer, for example, and you have steam chamber development, so this will be more of a kind of uniform development, but you could have a case where you can have a geological section like this, where the chamber kind of develops like that and going like this and like this. So this is injector and this is producer. So this is a good kind of development of the steam chamber, and this is maybe not as good, right? So you could have a section like this where you have that situation. Well, nevertheless, you know, you will see based on production rates that in overall the company was very successful in maintaining low cost of supply and producing oil from those section despite the challenges in the geology. So here we have basically more explanation to gross bitumen in place GBIP, petrophysical criteria, where porosity is over 27% and saturation is over less than 50%. So which is makes sense. So now they also did some seismic here. So we're not going to go in much detail, but you can see how they're basically able to better understand the geology on their asset at different timeframes here, where they acquired basically cores, the sections where they introduced basically, the drilled vertical sections and extracted the core and send it to the lab to analyze. And they did the seismic to better understand their lease and development lease. So here you can see pads AA to AE. So A to A in that in that example, where you have different pays and different essentially CPPOs. As mentioned before, CPPO stands for oil saturation from core, or typically oil saturation. And you see basically various kind of bitumen sections with higher oil saturation and with higher in other sections, but not as much in the middle sections. So that creates an opportunity for optimization. And you could have a pay, which is 40 meters here. So you can see here on the TVD. So as mentioned before, TVD stands for total vertical depth. When you see like SS is subsea essentially, and MD stands for measured depth, right? So you can see in this example 191, 156, right? So about 40 meters here. So 196 here, 151 here, 191. So about 40 meters. And 155, 193, 38 meters. So they do have really good kind of pays, but the challenge is again the heterogeneities here and here, and maybe that's why the company chose that in the 2024 activity they're going to spend $30 million on two well pairs, um, additional well pairs they're going to introduce to basically the asset, and maybe not the infills, even though I'm thinking if I personally was to optimize this asset, I will probably integrate the infills, and maybe I'll talk a little bit more about that, because there are kind of regional opportunities that I can see in those sections here, where maybe there is a drainage opportunity to introduce an infill well between um, the different kind of geologies. So this chart, I think is extremely powerful. Let's take a look at kind of what's going on here so we can better understand production at Hangingstone. So what you see here essentially is oil rate is in green. So oil rate is in green right here. So again, the asset starts at 2015, circulation phase for steam injection just to create communication between injector and producer. That happens based essentially in this area right here. We're ramping up steep, but you don't really see response of oil production. But you do see it a little bit later, which is what's happening kind of here. And then they get to a point where they produce about, I would say, 1,500 cubes a day. So if you want to convert 1,500 cubes a day, let's say, to barrels per day, you need to multiply by 6.29. So 6.29 times, let's say, 1.5, that's 9,400 barrels a day. So in this section here, right here, we have about 9,400 barrels per day. So I would say that will be kind of the peak, and over the next 9 years or so, you can see basically production sustained, but because they didn't really introduce any other infills, production is slowly declining. And so today, based on my numbers for the month of July, that's going to be probably close to the number in August. And so this is the month they're going to be reporting next. The production rate is about 7,214 that I was able to extract. So you can see basically no new wells were introduced, and the asset is doing quite well after 9 years of basically minimal expenditure on drilling new wells. It's almost unbelievable for a conventional guy, right? If you guys kind of think about this, to see this type of performance. Well, and despite the various challenges that I talked about from geological perspective. So when you look at essentially the production here, and again, we're just kind of to reiterate, we're currently at 7,200 barrels per day. Here at peak, we're like about over 9,000. So what we see that's really interesting about this asset, and maybe that's why as part of the future development that's happening essentially in the upcoming months. And I talked about that they're going to drill two well pairs, additional well pairs to sustain production. Is the reality is that they can, and the reason why they can is that you saw steam essentially at peak being injected at, let's say, 7,200 cubes per day, right? SOR during that time frame was fairly higher. So SOR stands for steam to oil ratio, and it talks about the efficiency of the operation. And what you can see also is that Over time, though, the steam is declining. So the question is, how were they able to sustain oil production here, right? um, in green and reduce the steam injection rate. How is this possible? Well, what they've done here, and this is what could be seen in the purple color, is that they did something that's called gas injection rate. So that stands for NCG coinjection. So non-condensable gas coinjection. And they essentially injected natural gas, which is recycled by producing and basically generating steam out of it. So it kind of gives it a second loop in the system. And you can see the gas rate in E3M3 per day. So E3M3, also the way we talk about this in reservoir engineering, stands for decks per day. And you can see basically the number in decks per day is that they injected at peak about 25, let's say, and currently they stabilized around 9 decks per day. I think if I was to guess what happened here is that they essentially injected all that gas, but then maybe they started having issues with something that's called NFE, non-flow events, which means that if we think about injector and producer and steam chamber development, what ends up happening is that you have a subcool or a liquid kind of phase here on top of the producer to limit any gas short circuiting. And I think what could have happened here is that it was very hard to maintain oil production, which is in green, and control the subcool from the operations, which is, because you don't want to sacrifice oil production. And so they almost had to maybe cut, and I'm just speculating, I don't really know, but if I was to guess, that would be the guess. Maybe they were getting a lot of NFEs, but at the same time, it looks like they were able to successfully reduce steam injection rate, which is great. So that area under the curve right here, that's the opportunity for future well pair development, where that steam it's about 2,000 cubes per day, so about 12,000 barrels per day. At SOR3, could add additional 4,000 barrels per day, right? So 4,000 times 3 is 12,000 barrels per day injection rate for steam. And you could produce at SOR3 4,000 barrels per day. And so today, if they produce 7,200 barrels per day, maybe they can go to about 10, maybe 10.5. So 10,000 or 10,500 barrels per day. So they could actually maybe lift that production that we've been talking about and increase it from back to the peak and back to here by injecting back the steam and maintaining low SOR. So that SOR is really key in their operations because, I mean, kudos to them. If you can see here, SOR initially for the first couple of years was very high. It was maybe about 5, but now SOR is, in my understanding, it continued to decline, and now it's closer to 3. So the SOR that I calculated based on the data that I used in my software from AER, the SOR they have right now is about 3.3. So 3.3. So the company did a really good job to continue reducing the SOR on the asset. The other thing we see is gas production rate. The gas production rate in orange is actually really intriguing to me personally because it tells you that the gas injection in purple started increasing, and then you saw a significant increase in gas production, and probably the reservoir engineers looked at the slight decline in oil production and needed to balance this. That's why you have better control of the produced gas and the gas injected to gas produced ratio, which is much healthier from going to like that aggressive NCG injection. But they had to do it, I think, in a sense to mitigate all of those geologies that I was talking about, because you do have a case here where you do have, as mentioned before, gas in pad A, E, and AD, and you do have a scenario where you have bottom water, right? So as mentioned here, bottom water. So you do have a case here and here. And so that thing, if you're not maintaining the bottom hole pressure, that thing could come really aggressively. So you have to sustain basically the bottom hole pressure while maintaining oil production and controlling your gas injection and gas produced rates as well to avoid any non-flow events, which are NFEs. But I think the great opportunity on this asset is really the fact that they were able to cut the steam injection rate, and they have that capability in the CPF. So right now, based on my calculations here that I see from what they reported, the software calculated about 24,000 barrels per day uh, injection from 25 injectors. 25 barrels per day, if I divide by 6.29, I get about 3,800 uh, barrels per day injection, right? So they were able to cut the steam all the way down to this level, which is great. And that's why SOR also declined, while oil production basically slightly decreased here to 7,200. But I'm pretty sure that they were able to mitigate that by injecting the steam back on the new well pairs and controlling the oil production rate and bringing it back. As mentioned before, I'm not concerned about WSR at all because it was very close to one. So, and that's a very useful metric because if they have bottom water, they could have issues with water coming in and kind of competing with that oil. But so far, they keep in a very healthy water to steam ratio, which tells me that the water to steam ratio is not an issue. Well count also, as you can see, very sustained over time, and maybe they had to like redrill a well because it's slightly increased here, right? But in overall well count, been sustained around 25, right? So maybe there was a well down. And another thing that I think is really powerful, and I really want to spend a little bit of time talking about this. So what I want to talk about in this specific moment is the flexibility that the management team had during a very nervous period in all of our times, right? When it comes to COVID. So you can see here this period of time, COVID hits, and what do you expect? From what I heard, that many investors they were saying, okay, shut in production, don't produce the oil because you basically oil went to minus 37 for like for like a day or so, but the company is getting paid on a monthly basis, so it didn't have uh, necessarily that huge of an impact when it comes to negative prices. But I think the overall like average prices for that for oil for that month was under $20, which is pretty bad, right? And so what this company was able to do is basically shut in the production for 3 or 4 months or so, and then restore it. Now, what's really powerful about this, and this is in our industry, was not obvious to us when it happened. Many people were worried that if you shut in production, just like what I was saying, when you have injector and producer and you maintain subcool, and this is kind of what a healthy subcool looks like. When you shut in production, all of that liquid is still draining downwards by gravity. So you could potentially flood the injector. And so many people were very stressed about this. What could happen if you flood the injector? And what ended up happening is that Athabasca was able to restore their oil production and get back to previous rates, which is really amazing. It was not obvious to many of us back then. So this is great. Kudos to the team for doing that, for doing a good job and executing. So this is an exciting development. And in the future, if oil prices declined, you know that this asset has this flexibility, basically going at minimal penalty, well, all things considered, obviously, and shutting in production temporarily, but then restoring production. And the key angle here, you could say, well, other assets in the Permian could do that as well. Well, not really, because you don't really, the well count does not necessarily change in this case, right? The steam capabilities does not change. The oil production does not change. You able to control basically a lot of the things, kind of basically turn things off and turn them back on with the same operations with minimal essentially damage that was seen here. So the other thing we want to talk about as well is the pad reservoir properties and recovery factors. So as mentioned before, what you see here is that the typical producer depth is about 191 TVD. And as mentioned before, TVD stands for total true vertical depth, right? So true vertical depth. And the initial reservoir pressure in that condition is about 600 kPa. So 600 kPa. So they operate at about 2 MPa, so 2000 kPa, the bottom hole pressure. And you cannot really exceed that. The initial reservoir temperature is about 8 C. When steam is being injected, this temperature gets closer to 220 C to basically reduce the viscosity of oil so it can be drained by gravity. And so if you look at the steam chamber later on, this section here is 8C, this is 220C, and what happens at the layer here is that you have basically condensation of the steam injected, and it drains because of that heat transfer kind of element, where you do have that steam developing the chamber further and further. And all of that happened under maintained bottom hole pressure, and the initial pressure is about 600 kPa, so 0.6 MPa. So that's the initial pressure, and you operate closer to 2. You could also operate at about 1 MPa. So that's not a problem. So when we talk about uh, the pads themselves, so you can see AA, AB, AC, AD, AE, we see that we have 5 well pairs each, so about 25 well pairs. Today, these well pairs produce about 7,200 barrels per day. So, and nothing really was changed for 9 years on this asset. You know, I've heard stories like a couple of years ago, somebody said, well, Hangingstone is just like a really horrible asset. But when you look at what the company was able to achieve, basically sustaining that oil production rate while cutting steam injection rate, while reducing SOR and reducing emissions, I think it's really important to be mindful of what this team was able to achieve. The problem is that not too many people can communicate independently, right? So I don't work for anyone. I just choose to talk about this. Nobody pays me. I'm not sponsored to do this. But they did an amazing job cutting emissions, sustaining oil production rates, reducing steam to oil ratio, and basically creating more capability for future steam utilization, like what we talked about, where they can go back to that 7,000 cubes per day and utilize the steam to produce more oil on that asset and make it more valuable. So the team did an amazing job. Now, what's unique about this, and that really applies to the lateral length in meters, is that you can see 850 meters wells on AA, 640, 750, 670, 830. What changed since then and what they're going to do this time is that the length of the laterals for the upcoming well pairs is going to be 1,400 meters. So in some cases, double from the previous legacy wells, which should result in higher productivity. You can see the area in cubes of oil production, oil saturation. As mentioned before, that oil saturation should be correlating with what was seen in the core in that CPPO sections, right? So you can see kind of the average oil saturation. And so you can see it basically here. So it's about 0.7. Porosity, very good porosity of 0.34, 0.36, 0.35. Permeabilities are looking decent, so 4.6, 5, 4.8. And the permeabilities in Z direction are, you know, they're not as strong, but they're decent. So about 3.6, 3.5, 2.9. Just give you an example, like perfect reservoir that I've ever seen, the permeability in X and Y direction will be like a C Darcy, and permeability in vertical direction will be maybe like a 5 Darcy. So just as a reference. So this is not ideal, but it's not too bad, you know. But the other thing that, you know, doesn't work in their necessarily benefit is those like complex geologies, like in the variation in oil saturation and the various kind of, we talked about this in detail, the various phases of classifications, the muddy IHSs, the sandy IHSs. So all those things, one needs to be kind of mindful of. This is maybe not applicable to investors necessarily, but my students that I'll be teaching soon, I ask you to kind of be mindful of that. Net pay, as mentioned before, they kind of consider that 40 meter, overall thickness, but reality, what could be drained, 25, 26, and maybe there are some cutoffs that come kind of in some of those sections, like here, right? Here, depends how they introduce the injector and producers. And that's why actually I think it's a great opportunity for them to maybe do redrills to better optimize without necessarily introducing well pairs, or even better, introduce infill wells. And the way they could do this, if you have injector and producer as an example, and you have those IHS barriers like this, let's say the steam chamber development maybe looks something like that. So maybe in this case, it could look something like this. And in this case, it could look something like that. Remember when we talked about temperatures, this is, let's say, 200 C, and this is also 200 C. This is still kind of 8C and 8C, but if you put an infill here, that heat transfer was taking place before, so that oil could be mobile. So maybe there's an opportunity to land an infill well and kind of capture more value and do it a little bit cheaper than drilling well pairs. But they have a lot of flexibility here because of their achievements in reducing the steam rate. So they essentially create more inventory for future infills, which is amazing too. So we can see here the cumulative oil production up to this date, which is 50 to 70% in kind of overall recovery factor that's possible. And we can see a relatively low recovery factors on the asset, which again kind of supports that point of what I was talking about when it comes to kind of infill wells, maybe accelerating production, stealing some from the overall pay from the boxes from the well pairs. But also maybe like redrills into zones that were maybe mobile, and basically, but there was some heat transfer. So that requires really some reservoir simulations here. But in overall, if you think about kind of the recovery factors, the asset been producing for 9 years and with no additional well pairs, doing an amazing job basically sustaining oil production here, which looks really good. Couple of kind of administrative things to kind of be mindful of is that EUR stands for Estimated Ultimal Recovery of Bitumen, and RF stands for Recoverable Bitumen Reserves to estimate bitumen in place in reservoir, and OBAP is gross oil volume between base and top of pay, inclusive of lean zone without saturation constraints. So there's lots of kind of nuances here, but long story short, you have basically a pay. You want to recover that pay. It's within that box of injector and producer, so injector producer. And if you kind of look laterally, that's kind of what it looks like. And within that box, you have 70% oil saturation, and you have a porosity component to it, and how much of that box you basically drained. And the answer here is 21%, 20%. Now it's a little bit more. Now it's like 30, 35, 40%. But if the possible basically estimate ultimate recovery factor of bitumen is 50 to 70%, then maybe those additional well pairs could do a good job sustaining production on the pad. Sorry, on the lease, right? So here, a little bit of communication on how they were able to maintain bottom hole pressure, and they talk about non-condensable gas co-injection. This is something I covered already because it's a very popular method in the industry to maintain bottom hole pressure and reduce steam injection requirement. So NCG co-injection has been expanded across all pads to help with pressure management. That's what they're talking about, and SOR reduction. They were very, very successful in doing that, reducing SOR essentially from 5 something to 3.3. NCG rates increased in early 2021 to assist with pressure recovery in the field following 2020 temporary suspension. Once the field reached pressure target, NCG rates were optimized. So what they're telling us is that maybe my assumption here with the NFEs was wrong, but maybe that peak they achieved, they were able, because you have coalescence, so steam chambers merging on the asset, maybe because of that non-condensable gas co-injection they were able to achieve, but the bottom hole pressures, and then they started cutting them. Even though, as I'm looking at this, I'm seeing the gas production increasing, and maybe that wasn't something favorable. So maybe that's why they also cut the NCG injection rate. Continuing vertical temperature growth at observation wells. So that's pretty good. So now they're talking a little bit about circulation phase, SECD phase for that AA03 startup rates, and the oil production. So that's kind of the update they provided, but I think it could be useful in this case, not necessarily talk about the specific well, but mostly kind of better understand that the bottom hole pressure, so injector bottom hole pressure and production heel pressure, you can see how they basically sustain, as I mentioned before, the injection bottom hole pressure, which is just under 2 MPa, and the various temperatures that I talked about, 200 degrees, 220 degrees, which is on the vapor pressure curve. This is where water becomes steam and those bottom hole pressures and sustain the steam without heat transfer. But obviously we have the heat transfer that we transfer the heat to bitumen to make it less viscous, so you can drain by gravity, and therefore we have the steam chamber growth and drainage of liquids. So what you see here, essentially those temperatures that I described, and the circulation phase, and then basically the oil production that's coming post this process. So this is again a picture of their central process facility, the pads here, like the injector and producers, and the lines that carry essentially the steam to the pads, and the emulsion lines that bring the stuff back to the CPF. One of those pipes is steam going to the pads. The other one is returning, if I was to guess, emulsion flow rate and liquid phase, and the other one is maybe casing gas with the gas that's being produced. And that's how they were able to basically reuse the NCG co-injection to their benefit. So here I made some notes. Want to cover this a little bit more. So this is oil production and steam injection over this period in 2022. Again, you can see a reduction in steam injection over time, and you can you can see reduction in steam injection over time. So going from this level, 5,500 or so, down to maybe 5,000 for that year, right? So now, as I mentioned before, the steam injection rate is in this level right here. So the company did a good job cutting steam injection rates while maintaining oil production rates, which on the decline curve also declining over time. And today, that production is at about 7,200 barrels per day, as mentioned before. So, and now we're in basically September 2024. And they're going to be introducing new well pairs, but they designed for, as mentioned before, they designed for the steam to be injected at 7,000 cubes per day, which is amazing. So 7,000 cubes per day, this will be about 44,000 barrels per day, and currently they're injecting about half that number, which is right here. So they have all of that opportunity to basically take the oil production that I was talking about and increase it, right? Because they can basically get to 9,200 barrels per day, maybe 10,000, by creating those sustaining well pairs. I'm not exactly sure if they're going to be doing this in those sections, but they told us before that this is approved pad drainage area adjacent to the other pads. So the well pairs will be coming here and doing a very similar job to what was done before. So I think, based on my estimates, production is going higher in Hangingstone, not lower. So on that note, one quick kind of summary of what I talked about. So today we covered the Hangingstone asset. We talked about the opportunity on the asset. When I usually talk about the asset, as I said in the past, um, people kind of don't really understand it very well and become right away judgmental, saying, "Well, it's a high cost of supply. It's an asset that not making any money." Well, they do have very nice operational netbacks. In the upcoming presentations, I will be showing that, so that's pretty good. And and I think we kind of covered all of the things associated with CPF. We talked about bitumen. We talked about their pads. This is really easy asset to understand. They have like 5 pads, 5 well on pads, and they've been doing this for about 9 years, basically producing oil that declined, at those rates. And now they can have that steam capability, that because they were able to inject non-condensable gas and maintain bottom hole pressure. They did a very good job sustaining water to steam ratio, which is close to 1. There's very little evidence of the short circuiting from the gas pockets from the upper overburden sections. And obviously, those sustaining well pairs are coming at 1,400 barrels a day, 1,400 meters lateral length, and hopefully coming at 1,400 barrels per day, right? But it's remained to be seen what kind of production rates they can achieve using those longer laterals. But they had really good success in Lismer, so I'm optimistic about that. So in overall, hopefully it helped to better understand Hangingstone. Um, just as I mentioned before, current production on the asset is about 7,214 barrels per day. This could change after I make this presentation, because and the SOR could change. So 3.3 is probably going to change, go a little bit higher, because they're going to circulate the injectors and producers, and then they're going to produce the oil, so the SOR will drop. The previous month before that, production was 7,252 barrels per day, and the overall production declined slightly by 0.5% month over month. But obviously, if the plants, come to realization, if they have the rigs in August, let's say now it's September, so in like 3 or 4 months, if they drill those like before basically kind of winter time and able to circulate and get, they have a lot of steam capability here. They don't really have to sacrifice any steam. They can just utilize the steam that they have. All they have to do is kind of rebalance the water balance, and utilize aquifers to basically bring more water to their central process facilities. But they were able to do this in the past as well, so I'm not very concerned. So essentially, the company is doing well when it comes to their asset, and this is probably their worst asset from the assets they have. Their jewel asset is called Lismer, and I will be talking in the upcoming sessions on Lismer. So thank you so much for listening to me. I appreciate your time. For investors, not a financial advice, not a recommendation. This is just an overview of the asset. To the employees and management team of Athabasca Oil, thank you for doing a good job. Thank you for sharing those slides in your AR disclosure, and hopefully I did justice explaining your asset and give you some ideas maybe on infill well integration and utilizing some of those geologies where you did see some heat transfers to the upper pay section, where you could utilize bitumen drainage from those sections, because the heat has been transferred over the 9 years that you've been injecting steam. And of course, good luck with the new well pairs, that the 1,400-meter well pairs that are going to be coming online. Looking forward to seeing the results for those. And yeah, keep up the good work. And for students, hopefully this session was helpful to get your project started. And we'll be doing reservoir simulations to kind of optimize various assets and better to understand steam assisted gravity drainage. So thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.